The stars burned cold and silent above the world of Vareth Prime as the Valoran fleet emerged from hyperspace, like a swarm of hungry locusts descending upon a field of grain. And the people below looked up at the darkening sky with terror in their hearts. Supreme Commander Kethrax stood at the center of his command ship, his forearms folded behind his back as he watched the blue and green planet grow larger on his view screen. And a feeling of absolute certainty filled his ancient mind because he had done this 1,000 times before, and the result was always the same. The Valoran Dominion had conquered over 200 star systems in 3 centuries, and not once had they tasted defeat because their kind was born for war and nothing else. Kethrax turned his triangular head toward his tactical officer and spoke in the clicking language of his people, asking how many ships defended this world. 47 warships of the Althean Confederacy hold position in high orbit. Supreme Commander, the officer replied with a slight tremor in his voice that was not fear but excitement. Kethrax made a sound that resembled laughter among his kind, a harsh clicking noise that echoed through the bridge like stones rattling in a metal container. And he wondered why these soft creatures even bothered to resist when the outcome was already written in the stars. The Althean Confederacy was a peaceful coalition of 4 alien species who had spent centuries building trade routes and cultural exchanges instead of weapons and warships. And now they would pay the price for their foolish trust in diplomacy. Launch all interceptors, Kethrax commanded. And within seconds, over 300 smaller craft poured from the bellies of his carrier ships, like insects spilling from a disturbed nest. Althean Defense Fleet opened fire with their energy weapons, bright blue beams cutting through the darkness of space. But the Valoran interceptors were too fast and too numerous, and for every one that fell to the defenders, 10 more took its place. Admiral Siren of the Althean flagship watched her ships die one by one, their lights winking out like candles in a storm. And she knew that this was the end of everything her people had built over thousands of years. All ships, focus fire on the command vessel, she ordered, her voice steady despite the despair that gripped her heart, because she would not let her crew see her afraid in these final moments. The Althean ships turned their weapons toward Kethrax's massive dreadnought, pouring everything they had into a single desperate attack. But the Valoran shields held firm against the assault like a mountain standing against the Winkethrax watched the pitiful attack with something close to boredom. And he wondered why the universe continued to produce such weak species who could not even provide him with a proper challenge. Return fire, he said simply. And his ship unleashed a barrage of plasma torpedoes that tore through the Althean flagship like claws through paper. Admiral Siren felt the deck beneath her feet shudder and crack as explosions ripped through her vessel. And in her final moments, she reached for the emergency beacon on her console, because there was one last thing she could do for her people. The beacon was old, built centuries ago by her ancestors when they first made contact with the wider galaxy, and it was programmed to send a distress signal to a region of space that the Galactic Council had declared forbidden. She pressed the button and whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening. As her ship came apart around her, the distress signal shot out into the void, traveling faster than light toward a distant corner of the galaxy where a species had been locked away and forgotten, a species that the Council had deemed too dangerous to walk among the stars on Vareth Prime. The people watched as their fleet burned in the sky above them, and they held their children close as the first Valoran dropships began their descent through the atmosphere like metal rain falling upon a doomed world. Kethrax addressed his fleet through the communication system, his voice carrying to every ship and every soldier under his command. "Begin the harvest," he ordered, and his words sealed the fate of billions. The Valoran soldiers poured onto the surface of Vareth Prime, their armored bodies gleaming in the light of the setting sun as they marched through the streets of cities that had stood for 10,000 years. The Althean people had no army to speak of, no weapons to defend themselves, and they could only run and hide as the invaders swept through their civilization like a plague of death. Watched the conquest unfold from his position in orbit, and he felt the satisfaction that came from another successful campaign. Another world added to the Dominion's ever-growing territory. He opened a channel to broadcast his message to the entire galaxy, because he wanted every species to hear his words and tremble. "This is Supreme Commander Kethrex of the Valoran Dominion," he announced, his voice cold and filled with absolute confidence. "And I speak now to all who watch from the safety of their distant worlds." He paused for effect, letting the silence stretch across the stars before continuing. "There is no force in this galaxy that can challenge the Dominion, and resistance is nothing more than a biological error that we will correct with fire and blood across 1,000 worlds." Leaders and citizens watched the broadcast with fear in their eyes, and none of them dared to speak against the Valoran conqueror because they knew that his words were true. The Galactic Council held an emergency session, but they could offer nothing more than diplomatic protests and empty condolences to the dying Althean people. No one would stand against the Valarans because no one could stand against them, and somewhere in the forbidden region of space, in a system that had been quarantined for 400 years, the distress signal finally reached its destination. A human communications officer aboard the patrol ship noticed the incoming transmission and frowned at her console because no signal should have been able to reach them through the Council's jamming network. She played the message and listened to the desperate plea of a dying admiral begging for help from anyone who could hear her voice. The officer looked at her captain with wide eyes and asked what they should do. The captain stared at the star map showing the distant Althean system and thought about the centuries of isolation his people had endured, locked away from the galaxy by species who feared what humanity might become. "Send this to Admiral Tanaka," he said quietly, "and tell her that someone out there finally needs our help." The message traveled through human space at incredible speed, passing from ship to ship until it reached the flagship of the 7th Expeditionary Fleet, where Admiral Yuki Tanaka sat in her ready room reviewing tactical reports. She read the distress signal 3 times before setting it down on her desk, and a cold smile spread across her face as she realized that after 400 years of waiting, humanity finally had a reason to return to the stars. The galaxy had forgotten about Earth and its children, but they were about to receive a very harsh reminder. Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood before the massive viewport of her flagship, the UTS Perseverance, and watched the endless darkness of space stretch out before her like an ocean without shores. She was 63 years old, with gray streaks running through her black hair and scars on her hands from battles fought long ago, and her eyes held the weight of someone who had seen too much death but still believed in something worth fighting. 4th distress signal played again on the speakers behind her, and she listened to the final words of Admiral Siren with a mixture of sadness and anger burning in her chest. "They quarantined us," she said to Captain James Chun, who stood beside her with his arms crossed over his broad chest. "And now they come begging for our help when their peaceful ways fail them." Chun nodded slowly and asked if she thought the Council would try to stop them from responding to the call. Tanaka turned away from the viewport and walked toward the holographic display at the center of her ready room, where a map of the galaxy glowed with soft blue light. "The Council locked our ancestors away 400 years ago because they watched us fight our civil wars and decided we were too dangerous to exist among civilized species," she said with bitterness in her voice. and they built jamming stations around our borders to keep us contained like animals in a cage. She touched the display and zoomed in on the region of space where Earth and her colonies had grown and prospered in isolation. 47 worlds connected by trade routes and defended by the mightiest fleet humanity had ever built. But they made a mistake. Tanaka continued with a cold smile. Because they gave us 4 centuries to prepare for the day when someone would finally need us. Chan studied the map and traced the route from human space to the Althean system with his finger, calculating the distance and the time it would take to reach the dying world. The Valorans have never faced an enemy like us, he said quietly. And their ships are built for conquering soft targets who cannot fight back. Tanaka nodded and turned to face the viewport once more as memories flooded through her mind like water. Breaking through a dam, she remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell about the old days before the quarantine, when human traders and explorers walked among the stars, alongside dozens of other species, and she remembered the day when the Council decided that humanity was a threat to galactic peace because they had watched the bloody civil war that tore her apart and killed billions. The aliens had never understood that humanity's capacity for violence was matched only by their capacity for love and loyalty. And they had looked at the destruction of the Civil War without seeing the courage of those who fought to end the tyranny that caused it. My grandmother died believing that we would return to the stars one day, Tanaka said softly, and she told me that when that day came, we should show the galaxy what humans really are. Chun asked what she meant by that, and Tanaka turned to face him with fire burning in her dark eyes. We are not the monsters they feared, she replied, but we will become monsters for those who prey upon the innocent. She walked to her communication console and opened the channel to Earth Command, where the leaders of the United Terran Federation waited for her. Report General Marcus Webb appeared on the screen, his weathered face showing the strain of countless years spent defending humanity from threats both internal and external. Admiral Tanaka, he said with a nod of greeting. We have reviewed the distress signal and the intelligence reports from our long-range probes. Tanaka stood at attention and waited for his decision, though she already knew what it would be because she understood the heart of her people. The Valoran Dominion has committed atrocities against the civilian population, Webb continued, and they believe that no one in the galaxy has the power to stop them. He leaned forward and his eyes grew hard as stone as he spoke his next words. The Federation Council has voted unanimously to authorize military intervention, and you are hereby ordered to take the 7th Expeditionary Fleet to Althean space and neutralize the Valoran threat by any means necessary. Tanaka felt her heart swell with pride and purpose as she acknowledged the order and promised that she would not fail. The communication ended and she immediately opened a fleet-wide channel to address the men and women under her command. This is Admiral Tanaka speaking to all personnel of the 7th Expeditionary Fleet, she announced as her voice carried across 40 warships and reached the ears of over 50,000 sailors and marines. For 400 years, we have been locked away from the galaxy by species who feared our strength and our passion. And for 400 years, we have built our ships and trained our soldiers for a day that many believed would never come. She paused and let her words sink in before continuing. That day has arrived, and we have received a cry for help from a peaceful people who are being slaughtered by an empire that has never known defeat across the fleet. Men and women stopped their work and listened to their admiral with growing determination in their hearts. The Valorans believe they are fearless because they have never faced a true enemy, and they think that nothing in the universe can challenge their power. Tanaka smiled, and her voice grew strong with conviction. They are wrong, and we are going to teach them what it means to face the wrath of humanity. Cheers erupted throughout the fleet as soldiers and sailors raised their fists and shouted their approval. and the sound of their voices echoed through the metal corridors like thunder rolling. Across a stormy sky, Captain Chun began issuing orders to prepare for departure. And within hours, the massive engines of the Seventh Fleet roared to life with power that could shake the foundations of worlds. The UTS Perseverance led the formation as 40 warships aligned themselves for the jump to hyperspace. Their hulls painted black and gray like shadows given form and purpose. These were not ships built for exploration or diplomacy, and they carried no scientists or ambassadors within their armored walls. These were weapons of war, designed by a species that had spent its entire history fighting and surviving against impossible odds. And every system and every component had been crafted with a single goal in mind: victory at any cost. Tanaka took her seat in the command chair and looked at the star map one final time, tracing the route to Vareth Prime, where billions of innocent lives hung in the balance. All ships report ready for hyperspace jump. Chun announced from his station. Tanaka nodded and gave the order that would change the course of galactic history. Take us to war. The fleet vanished into hyperspace with a flash of brilliant light, leaving behind the safety of human territory and racing toward a confrontation that would shake the foundations of empires. And somewhere in the depths of the UTS Perseverance, a young Marine named Sarah Rodriguez checked her rifle for the 100th time and thought about the stories her father used to tell. About the old days, he had always said that humans were meant for something greater than hiding in the shadows. And now she was going to prove him right. The Valorans had never faced an enemy who refused to surrender. An enemy who would fight to the last breath and the last bullet. An enemy who had spent 4 centuries preparing for this exact moment. They had no idea what was coming for them. And by the time they understood, it would already be too late. 3 weeks had passed since the conquest of Vareth Prime, and Supreme Commander Kethrax had transformed the beautiful world into a nightmare of suffering and despair. The Valoran harvesting operations continued without pause as millions of Althean citizens were loaded onto transport ships and carried away to labor camps scattered across the Dominion's vast territory. Kethrax stood on the balcony of what had once been the Althean Parliament building and watched the smoke rise from the burning cities below with satisfaction gleaming in his compound eyes. Report on the harvest progress, he commanded to his aide who stood trembling behind him. We have collected approximately 40 million subjects for transport, Supreme Commander, the aide replied, and our projections indicate that the planet will be fully processed within 6 standard months. Kethrax made a clicking sound of approval and turned his attention to the night sky where his fleet maintained its position, in high orbit like a crown of steel, and fire surrounding the conquered world. The other species of the galaxy had sent their diplomatic protests and their empty words of condemnation. But not a single ship had come to challenge the Dominion's authority. This was how it always went. And Kethrax had grown bored with the predictable cowardice of the civilized races who talked endlessly about justice, but never had the courage to fight for it. Supreme Commander, a voice crackled through his communication device. We are detecting unusual energy signatures at the edge of the system. Kethrax lifted the device to his mandibles and asked for clarification. Unknown vessels have emerged from hyperspace approximately 2 light hours from our position, the officer reported, and their configuration does not match any known species in our database for the first time in many years. Kethrax felt a spark of interest ignite within his ancient mind, and he ordered his shuttle to return him to his command ship immediately within the hour. He stood once again on the bridge of his dreadnought and studied the sensor readings with growing curiosity. The unknown ships were holding position at the system's edge, neither advancing nor retreating, and their complete silence on all communication frequencies was deeply unsettling. How many vessels? Kethrax demanded. 40 ships of various sizes, his tactical officer replied. And their hull configurations suggest heavy armor plating and significant weapons capabilities. Kethrax studied the angular shapes on his display screen and noted that these ships look nothing like the elegant curves and flowing lines favored by most galactic civilizations. These vessels were brutal and functional, designed without any concern for beauty or grace, built only for the purpose of destruction. They are likely scavengers or pirates hoping to claim salvage from our conquest. Kethrax concluded with a dismissive wave of his upper arms. And we will teach them the price of their foolishness. He ordered 300 interceptors to engage the unknown fleet and destroy them as a warning to any others who might consider challenging Valoran supremacy. The interceptors launched from their carrier ships and raced toward the distant intruders with weapons armed and pilots eager for the glory of combat. Thrax watched the engagement unfold on his tactical display with casual interest, expecting the brief flash of combat followed by the familiar sight of enemy ships burning in the void. But what happened next would haunt his nightmares. For the rest of his very short life, the interceptors closed to weapons range and open fire with their plasma cannons, sending streams of superheated energy toward the unknown vessels. The enemy ships did not attempt to dodge or retreat, and Kethrax assumed they were simply too slow to evade the incoming fire. Then the unknown vessels returned fire, and the universe changed forever. Brilliant flashes of light erupted from the angular warships as they launched projectiles that traveled at speeds no Valoran sensor system could properly track. The first wave of interceptors simply ceased to exist, torn apart by impacts that punched through their hulls like needles through soft flesh. Kethrax leaned forward in his sus command chair and demanded an explanation for what he was seeing. The enemy weapons appear to be kinetic accelerators of some kind, his tactical officer stammered, with fear creeping into his voice. And they are launching solid projectiles at approximately 3% of light speed. 3% of light speed was impossible, or so Kethrax had always believed, because no civilization in the known galaxy possessed such primitive yet devastating technology. The remaining interceptors attempted to scatter and regroup, but the enemy weapons tracked them with terrifying precision and continued to cut them down, like a farmer harvesting grain within minutes. All 300 interceptors had been destroyed, and the unknown fleet began to advance toward Vareth Prime. With slow and deliberate purpose, silence fell over the bridge of Kethrax's command ship as every officer stared at their displays in disbelief. Get me identification on those ships, Kethrax ordered with a voice that trembled slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. His communications officer worked frantically at his console before turning back with terror written across his features. Supreme Commander, we have cross-referenced the vessel configurations with historical archives from the Galactic Council, he reported. And we have found a match. Kethrax demanded to know what species would dare challenge the Dominion with such devastating weapons. They are called humans, the officer replied. And according to Council records, they were quarantined in a distant region of space 400 years ago because they were deemed too dangerous for civilized society. The words struck Kethrax like a physical blow, and he suddenly understood why the Galactic Council had never attempted to stop his conquests. They were not cowards at all, and they had simply been waiting for someone to wake the sleeping giant that they had locked away. Centuries ago, a communication request flashed on his display, and Kethrax realized that the humans were attempting to contact him. He hesitated for a long moment before accepting the transmission, and the face that appeared on his screen was unlike anything he had expected. The human was female, with dark hair streaked with gray and eyes that burned with cold fury. and she wore a uniform of black and silver that marked her as a military commander. "This is Admiral Yuki Tanaka of the United Terran Navy," she announced in a voice that carried absolute authority. "And I am addressing the commander of the Valoran forces occupying this system." Kethrax straightened himself to his full height and responded with all the arrogance he could muster. "I am Supreme Commander Kethrax of the Valoran Dominion, and you have made a fatal error by bringing your pathetic fleet into our territory." The human admiral did not flinch or show any sign of fear, and her expression remained as cold and hard as the armor plating on her warships. "You have one chance to withdraw your forces from this system and release all prisoners immediately," she said. "And this is the only warning you will receive." Kethrax laughed at her words and told her that the Dominion had conquered 200 star systems and had never known defeat. "Your 40 ships are facing an armada of 2,000, he boasted. "And you will die screaming in the void like all the others who challenged our might." Admiral Tanaka smiled. And in that smile, Kethrax saw something that made his blood run cold. "We were hoping you would say that," she replied, "because we have been waiting 400 years for someone to give us a reason to fight." The transmission ended, and Kethrax stared at the blank screen as a feeling he had never experienced began to crawl through his mind. It was fear, pure and simple, and he hated himself for feeling it, but deep in his heart, he knew that everything was about to change. The Valoran Armada moved into attack formation like a great swarm of metallic insects. 2,000 ships spreading across the darkness of space in a pattern designed to overwhelm and destroy any enemy through sheer number. Supreme Commander Kethrax watched from his command throne as his fleet prepared to crush the human intruders, and he told himself that the fear he had felt moments ago was nothing more than a temporary weakness. "All ships, advance and engage," he ordered, and the Armada surged forward with weapons charging and shields at full power. The human fleet held its position without moving. 40 angular warships arranged in a tight defensive formation that seemed almost suicidal. Against such overwhelming odds, Admiral Tanaka stood at the center of her bridge, with her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes fixed on the approaching enemy. "All ships, prepare for combat," she announced through the fleet-wide channel. "And remember your training." Captain Chan reported that the Valoran Vanguard would reach weapons range in approximately 4 minutes, and he asked if the Admiral wished to give any final orders. Tanaka shook her head and replied that her people knew what to do. "We are the United Terran Navy," she said with quiet pride, "and we do not require speeches to find our courage." The first wave of Valoran ships opened fire as they entered range, unleashing a storm of plasma bolts and energy beams that lit up the void like a deadly aurora. Human point defense systems activated automatically, filling the space around each ship with a web of rapid-fire projectiles that intercepted incoming fire with mechanical precision. The plasma bolts that made it through the defensive screen splashed harmlessly against layered armor, plating that had been designed to withstand far worse punishment. "Return fire," Tanaka commanded, and the human fleet responded with devastating force. Railgun batteries along the spine of each warship erupted with synchronized fury, launching tungsten rounds at velocities that turned simple metal into weapons of mass destruction. First Valoran ships in the Vanguard simply disintegrated as the hypervelocity projectiles punched through their shields and hulls. Without slowing down, Kethrax watched in horror as dozens of his ships vanished in expanding clouds of debris, and he realized that the weapons he had witnessed destroying his interceptors were even more terrifying when fired from these larger vessels. "Concentrate fire on the lead human ship," he screamed at his tactical officers, "and bring it down now." 500 Valoran warships turned their weapons toward the UTS Perseverance, and unleashed everything they had. In a single massive barrage, the human flagship shuddered under the assault as explosions rippled across its armored hull. But it did not break, and it did not retreat. Admiral Tanaka gripped the armrest of her command chair as damage reports flooded in from across the ship. And she smiled grimly because her vessel was holding together, exactly as its designers had promised, armor integrity at 87%. Chun reported with admiration in his voice. And all weapon systems remain operational. The Perseverance returned fire with a full broadside that carved through the enemy formation like a blade through water. And 6 more Valoran ships died in the span of 3 seconds across the battlefield. UN warships fought with a ferocity that the Valorans had never encountered in all their centuries of conquest. When Valoran vessels attempted to close for ramming attacks, human ships held their ground and traded fire at point-blank range, refusing to give a single meter of space. When swarms of interceptors descended upon the human formation, automated defense systems cut them apart faster than the Valoran pilots could react, and when damaged human ships found themselves surrounded by enemies, their crews continued fighting until the last weapon fell silent and the last breath left their bodies. The Valorans had built their empire on the assumption that all species valued survival above victory, and they had never imagined that anyone would fight with such complete disregard for their own lives. But humans were different, and 400 years of isolation had only strengthened their resolve to prove themselves worthy of the stars. Keth Rax watched the battle unfold with growing desperation as his numerical advantage melted away like snow under a burning sun. His fleet had destroyed only 2 human ships in the first hour of combat, while the humans had eliminated over 400 of his vessels with their relentless and precise fire. "This is impossible," he muttered to himself as another squadron of his finest warships disappeared in flashes of light and expanding debris. His tactical officer approached with trembling legs and reported that fleet morale was collapsing across all ship categories. "Our warriors are experiencing an emotion that has not been recorded in Valoran history for over 1,000 years," the officer said with shame in his voice. Keth Rax demanded to know what emotion could possibly affect his fearless soldiers. "They are afraid, Supreme Commander," came the terrible reply, "and they are beginning to break formation and flee." The words struck Kethrax like a blade to the heart, and he looked at his display screen to see that his officer spoke the truth. Valoran ships were scattering in all directions, abandoning their comrades and racing for the safety of hyperspace with no thought of glory or honor. The hive link that connected all Valoran minds was flooding with panic and terror, emotions that his species had not felt since the ancient days before they rose to dominate their home world. And at the center of the chaos, the human fleet continued its methodical advance, destroying fleeing ships with the same cold efficiency they had shown from the beginning. Admiral Tanaka watched the Valoran formation collapse and felt no joy in the victory that was unfolding before her eyes. These creatures had committed terrible crimes against innocent people, but she took no pleasure in killing, and she wished that they had simply accepted her offer to withdraw. "Admiral," Chun said quietly, "the enemy flagship is attempting to retreat toward the far side of the planet." Tanaka nodded and ordered the destroyer UTS Vengeance to intercept and disable the vessel. "I want their commander alive if possible," she said, "because he needs to answer for what he has done here." The Vengeance broke formation and accelerated toward the fleeing dreadnought with engines burning at maximum power. Keth Rax saw the human ship approaching and screamed at his crew to increase speed. But his vessel was too large and too slow to outrun the sleek predator that was closing in from behind. "All weapons, target that ship and destroy it," he commanded. But his voice had lost its authority, and his officers moved with the sluggish motions of beings who had already accepted their defeat. The Vengeance dodged the incoming fire with graceful maneuvers that seemed impossible for a ship of its size, and it continued to close the distance with predatory patience on the surface of Vareth Prime. The Alphean prisoners looked up at the sky and watched the distant flashes of light that marked the death of their conquerors. They did not know who had come to save them, but they fell to their knees and wept with gratitude because hope had finally returned to their broken world. And in the void above, the last remnants of the once mighty Valorn armada scattered like leaves before a hurricane. Fleeing from an enemy that had proven the ultimate truth of warfare, it was not numbers or technology that determined victory, but the willingness to fight without fear and without compromise. The humans had learned this lesson through centuries of bloody conflict among themselves, and now they were teaching it to the Galactic HFY. Watched the Vengeance fill his view screen and understood that his reign of terror had finally come to an end. The UTS Vengeance closed on the fleeing Valoran dreadnought with the patience of a hunter who knows that its prey cannot escape. Commander David Park stood at the helm of his destroyer and watched the massive enemy vessel grow larger on his view screen, and he felt the weight of history pressing down upon his shoulders. "Target their engines," he ordered, "and let us end this chase." The Vengeance's railguns spoke with thunderous authority, and 3 hypervelocity rounds punched through the dreadnought's rear armor and tore apart the propulsion systems that had carried it across a loss. 100 conquered worlds, supreme. Commander Kethrax felt his ship shudder and die beneath him as the engines went silent and the emergency lights flickered to life throughout the bridge. "We are dead in space," his tactical officer reported with a voice empty of hope, "and the human vessel is moving to intercept." Kethrax stood from his command throne and looked around at the officers who had served him through decades of glorious conquest, and he saw nothing but fear and despair in their compound eyes. The hive link that connected his mind to all Valoran consciousness was filled with screaming and chaos as thousands of his soldiers died in the void around Vareth Prime. He had built his empire on the foundation of fear, using terror as a weapon to crush any who might dare to resist. And now that same fear had turned against him like a serpent eating its own tail. "Open a channel to the human ship," he commanded, because he wanted to speak with the beings who had destroyed everything he had built. Commander Park appeared on the view screen, a young man with cold eyes and a face that showed no emotion despite the magnitude of what he had accomplished. "This is Supreme Commander Kethrax of the Valoran Dominion," Kethrax announced with the last shreds of his dignity. "And I demand to know who you are." Park studied the alien creature on his screen and replied with simple words that carried the weight of centuries. "I am Commander David Park of the United Terran Navy, and you are defeated." Kethrax laughed bitterly and asked how 40 ships could have destroyed an armada that had never known failure. "Your ships were built to fight enemies who were already afraid," Park explained, "and your warriors had never faced an opponent who would rather die than surrender." He leaned forward and his eyes grew hard as diamonds. "You made the mistake of believing that fear was the ultimate weapon, but you never understood that there are things more powerful than fear." Kethrax demanded to know what could possibly be stronger than the terror that had brought 200 worlds to their knees. "Hope," Park replied simply, "and the courage to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves." On the bridge of the UT's Perseverance, Admiral Tanaka monitored the conversation and prepared to broadcast a message to the entire system, all Valoran forces. "This is Admiral Yuki Tanaka of the United Terran Navy," she announced on every frequency. "And your fleet has been destroyed, and your commander has been captured." She paused to let her words travel across the battlefield where the burning wreckage of over 1,400 Valoran ships drifted like fallen leaves on a cosmic wind. You have 1 hour to surrender your ground forces and release all prisoners, or we will begin orbital bombardment of your positions. The threat was not a bluff, and the Valoran soldiers on the surface of Vareth Prime understood that their choices had narrowed to two: surrender or die within 30 minutes. Valoran commanders across the planet began transmitting their capitulation, laying down their weapons and releasing the Althean prisoners they had been preparing to transport. Admiral Tanaka watched the surrender unfold and felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. Because victory had come at a terrible cost, and she knew that the galaxy would never be the same. Launch the Marine shuttles, she ordered, and begin liberation operations. Dropships carrying human Marines descended through the atmosphere of Vareth Prime, their armored hulls cutting through the smoke-filled sky like angels arriving from heaven. Private Sarah Rodriguez was among the first to set foot on alien soil, and she felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at the devastation that the Valorans had wrought upon this beautiful world. Althean survivors emerged from hiding places throughout the ruined cities, their eyes wide with disbelief as they watched the human soldiers secure Valoran prisoners and distribute emergency supplies. A young Althean girl approached Sarah with hesitation in her steps, and she looked up at the towering human with wonder and fear mixed together in her innocent face. "Are you the monsters they warned us about?" she asked in broken standard, because she had heard the old stories about the dangerous species that the council had locked away. Sarah knelt down to meet the child's eyes and removed her helmet so that the girl could see her face. "Only to those who hurt the innocent," she replied gently, and she reached out to take the child's hand. The girl smiled for the first time in weeks and asked if the humans would stay to protect her people. "We will stay as long as you need us," Sarah promised, "because that is what we do." Across the galaxy, the news of the Battle of Vareth Prime spread like wildfire through communication networks and diplomatic channels. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session, and representatives from dozens of species stared at each other with a mixture of shock and fear as they reviewed the footage of the human fleet obliterating the Valoran Armada. "We quarantined them to protect the galaxy," the council chairman said with a trembling voice. "But we never imagined they would grow so powerful in their isolation." Another representative asked what the humans intended to do now that they had broken free from their prison. "They have made no demands and issued no threats," the chairman replied, "and their admiral has stated only that they will protect those who cannot protect themselves." The words hung in the air like a promise and a warning, and every member of the council understood that the balance of power had shifted, for Admiral Tanaka remained in orbit above Vareth Prime as reconstruction efforts began on the surface below, and she spent long hours staring out the viewport at the stars that had been denied to her people for 4 centuries. Captain Chen approached and asked what she was thinking. "I am thinking about my grandmother," she replied softly, "and I wonder if she would be proud of what we have done here." Chen assured her that any ancestor would be honored by such a victory. Tanaka shook her head and turned to face her friend with sadness in her eyes. "We killed thousands today," she said, "and I do not know if that is something to celebrate, even if those we killed were monsters." Chen placed a hand on her shoulder and reminded her of the millions of innocent lives they had saved. "The Valorans gave us no choice," he said, "and we did what was necessary to stop their cruelty." Tanaka nodded slowly and returned her gaze to the stars. "We have announced ourselves to the galaxy," she said, "and now we must prove that we are worthy of their trust in the brig of the vengeance." Supreme Commander Kethrax sat alone in his cell and contemplated the ruins of everything he had believed, had thought himself fearless because no enemy had ever challenged him. And he had built an empire on the suffering of weaker species. But the humans had shown him the truth about fear and courage. And he understood now that true fearlessness was not the absence of something. To fight it, it was the willingness to face any enemy and any odds in defense of what was right. The humans had spent 4 centuries locked away from the stars. And they had used that time to become something that the galaxy had never seen before. They were warriors who fought for love instead of conquest. And their strength came not from hatred, but from Hopikithrax. Closed his compound eyes and accepted that his time was over. The age of the Valaran dominion had ended. And the age of humanity had just begun, and somewhere on the surface of Vareth Prime, a little Althean girl held the hand of a human soldier and looked up at the sky where the stars shone bright with the promise of a better tomorrow.